Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard from the expert witnesses that the facts are fairly obvious, but the application of the facts is a little difficult. You heard about the scar in Mr. Ramirez's back that had jagged edges, and that could have happened when that could only have happened when he was moving. But the experts couldn't tell us in which direction he was moving. So he could have been standing up or down. He just had to be moving when it happened. And also they told us that the trajectory, that is the direction of the shot, couldn't really tell us much either, even though they both thought that their side of the case was supported by the facts. They couldn't conclusively say, because when the bullet hit the shoulder blade, it fragmented and changed direction. Now, the burden of proof in this case is on Mr. Ramirez. He has to prove, by the preponderance of the evidence, that Mr. Ramirez was shot. He himself was shot without any adequate justification. Now, the Chicago Police Manual states that adequate justification is, and I quote, for shooting, is a police officer may use deadly force to prevent death or bodily injury to an officer or another person. If the knife was there, then there was certainly deadly force, because a knife can kill people. And if the knife there, and Mr. Ramirez was using it to stab Officer Levy, then there was adequate justification for the shooting. Now, we know two things for certain. We know that the knife was discovered at the scene of the crime, and the second thing that we know was that Officer Levy was stabbed. Now, from these facts, we can decide to believe Mr. Ramirez's story or Officer Waldman and Officer Levy's story. But we also have to think about what the logical conclusions for these stories would be. Now, according to Mr. Ramirez, he didn't have the knife. He didn't see the knife. He certainly didn't try and stab Officer Waldman with the knife. And yet the knife was found there, and Officer Levy was still stabbed. So if you believe Mr. Ramirez's story, you have to believe that Officer Waldman shot Mr. Ramirez just because Officer Levy was fighting with him. And then they tried to frame Mr. Ramirez so that their crime would not be discovered. So they planted a knife on the scene of the crime. Now, the funny thing was that these police officers had a lot of experience. Officer Waldman had been serving in the police force for over 15 years, and they knew the importance of evidence. But, for all that, they left the knife closed on the scene of the crime, and they would have known as well as you and I do, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that if the knife is locked open, there's no way that it can close when it hits the ground. They would have also have had to have stabbed Officer Levy themselves in order to cover for their crimes. And strangely enough, no blood was found on the knife, even though Officer Levy and Waldman would have known the importance of having blood on that knife. There was also no fingerprints on the knife, which Officer Levy and Waldman could have put on if Mr. Ramirez's hand was open. They could have just put the fingerprints on like that. Or, instead of believing Mr. Ramirez's story, you can believe Officer Waldman and Officer Levy's stories. Now, we know that Mr. Ramirez had gone to 2 bars during that night, and he had also drunk 4 or 5 Scotch and waters. And before that, he had drunk 2 beers. And he was behaving in a little bit of a erratic manner. He and his friends had a race in the park at just after 2 o'clock in the morning. And he also got quite upset by Officer Levy's slow driving. And yet he's asking us to believe that it was Officer Levy who first hit him and he didn't start the fight. Now, is it more probable that a police officer who's on the lookout for a criminal would start the fight, or a man who's been drinking and who, by his own words, is feeling exhilarated, and who is also angry at the officer's slow driving, would it be more likely that Mr. Ramirez started the fight, or that Officer Levy started the fight? Now, you have heard the opposing counsel give a number of weaknesses in our case, and I've written them up on the board here. And we'll see whether these are insuperable difficulties or whether they are easy to understand. Okay, well, the opposing counsel and Officer Waldman himself stated that Officer Waldman had a record of use of excessive force. 4 times he had been reprimanded for using excessive force in 4 different towns. However, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this happened 10 years ago, and Officer Waldman was honest, and he told you about his use of excessive force. And as we know, when we honestly state that we've done something and then we turn away from it, and it's so long in the past, it's a whole 10 years ago, surely he should be able to be forgiven for these offences and it not be held against him. Now, the lack of fingerprints on the knife. Now, the fingerprints on the knife could have quite easily been got rid of just by his hand moving, Mr. Ramirez's hand moving on the knife while he was fighting with Officer Levy. Or they might have possibly have come off the knife due to the police not handling the weapon properly. Now, the third item, that there was no blood on the knife. Well, there are probably 2 explanations for this. One is that while Officer Levy and Mr. Ramirez were struggling together, the blood on the knife somehow got wiped off. The other thing is that when Mr. Ramirez stabbed Officer Levy, he would have had to have gone through his shirt when he stabbed him. And most likely, when he drew the knife out, the blood wiped off on the shirt. Now, the other so-called weakness in our case was that the knife was closed on the ground. And we know that the knife, if it was fully open, would not have closed by just dropping it on the ground. However, what happened if the knife wasn't fully closed? See, look, the knife's almost fully open here, but it's not locked. And you can stab something with it and pull it out again, and it doesn't lock. And in this condition, if you dropped it on the floor, it could close. Now, to the last one. Officer Waldman and Officer Levy both testified that Mr. Ramirez was using his right hand to hold the knife. And yet Mr. Ramirez is left-handed. Now, why would this be? Well, there are 2 explanations for this. One of which was where he was sitting in the car. Now, I didn't pick this up for a while because I'm an Australian, and over here, all of our steering wheels are on the right-hand side of the car. In what would be in America, the passenger side of the car. But you see, over in America, of course, the driver's seat is on the left-hand side. Now, both the glove compartment and the compartment between the seats are on the right-hand side. So if the knife was in either of those, it would have been his right hand that he used to pick up the knife. And you must also remember that Mr. Ramirez was certainly feeling exhilarated when he picked up the knife, and probably wasn't thinking all that clearly. So you see that all of these weaknesses in our case can be explained. Now, you may be thinking that it's probably it's probably a little unusual or improbable that all these things would happen in the one case. However, consider the alternative. The alternative is that 2 experienced officers did a pretty bad job of trying to frame Mr. Ramirez. Not only did they have the knife closed, they also didn't have any fingerprints on the knife, nor did they have any blood on the knife, even though they'd had to use the knife to stab Officer Levy. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have a choice. You can either reward Mr. Ramirez for the mistakes he had made. You can make the police department and ultimately the taxpayer pay for the mistakes that Mr. Ramirez made. Or you can fine for my client, Officer Waldman, and say that Mr. Ramirez has to pay for his own mistakes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.